Okay. Garrett had texted me the other day saying, hey, I may not be able to make it back from, I think he's at Fort Campbell for some sort of training thing, Kentucky. If I'd have known he was going, we could have told him Wes and Riley are down there and got hooked up and everything. But very quickly, I hope very quickly, I hope it goes quickly for you anyway. The other night, we were talking to Lee about just kind of a widespread lack of normal behavior, what we would kind of call normal behavior in our society. And we see a lot of craziness going on. If you do any reading on the internet and some of the headlines and kind of follow those things, you think people are absolutely going nuts. And because it is the internet, 320 million of us read about the one person doing something that's nuts, but we keep reading about this same person over and over again. And maybe the world is going a little bit crazier than what it needs to be. We can be fooled into thinking that crazy is the norm, when maybe crazy is not the norm. The reality is a little bit more the norm for now, but it does seem like things are getting a little bit crazier. When we talk about normal behavior, or more properly really normative behavior, we're talking about the normal expectation that somebody would have in society of how a person is going to behave. Okay, and then we can base our reactions on how we think they are going to behave. When an immigrant from a third world nation comes to a first world nation, there's a lot of stuff that they do not understand. Okay, many years ago, when Ron and I lived in Sacramento, my neighbor was from maybe Bosnia or something like that. I don't remember just what the circumstance was, but he was definitely from a different country. And he was changing the oil in his car. That's a normative thing. You'd expect that to happen. And then when he was done, he took this big pan of oil and walked out to the street, to the drain, that feeds the river, and just dumped it right in the river. I'm like, stop! We don't do that here. It was way outside the range of normative behavior, but it was normative from where he came from. It just kind of a bad thing. One of the things that maybe keeps some of those third world countries down in the third world is that sort of thing. There's a lot more pollution going on, that kind of thing. But normative behavior is kind of a function of our technology in some cases. Some places they wouldn't even know how to drive a car. I live in a place where if my neighbor came up to me and said, hey, can you mow this field for me? I'd be completely lost as to what to do at the back end of that horse to get that field mowed, okay? I wouldn't have any idea. I think I've told you before, when my grandfather was growing up, his father bought the first tractor practically in the county. And, after an hour of fighting the thing, my grandfather got off the thing, went back into the barn, got the horses, brought the horses out because he understood the horses didn't have the clues to the tractor. So technology plays into what is normative behavior. Education plays into it, of course. And in a lot of cases, what I'm going to call societal homogeneity. Big word, meaning that do we have a common understanding of things of what normative behavior really is? And if you have a melting pot type society where people come from all over, that idea of what is normative behavior is going to have a wider spread in like a bell curve than what it would if everybody spoke a single language and did a particular thing. I think the idea of normative behavior in France, for example, was a lot tighter than what it is right now because they've had a lot of immigration and everything else. My earliest introduction to this type of a thing, even though I didn't know it really at the time, was when I was probably 8 or 10 years old. My grandfather took me down to Mexico to visit an orphanage in Ensenada, Mexico. And as we were driving through the village, I looked over and saw the head of a hog, on the table at the market, okay, with a bunch of kids running around playing and everything else. And this was not normative behavior, okay? In my realm of experience, nothing like that. I had never, ever seen anything like that, and I was just absolutely aghast, okay? Now, my grandfather grew up on the farm 100 years ago, okay? And would have done that dozens of times, if not hundreds of times, that butchered hogs. And it, didn't bother him a bit. His idea of what normative behavior was and mine were, night and day, a lot different. So, if you drove to Bible study tonight on the right side of the road, you exhibited a normative behavior, right? You're driving on the right-hand side of the road. And we expect that of everybody around here. And when somebody starts driving on the other side of the road, they kill somebody. But if you go to England, to Great Britain, the normative behaviors drive on the other side. And it's a very difficult transition to make. It was frightening to me for Ron and the boys in the car. I think it was even worse. But it was just like all over the road. When I was growing up, there was a gal in the church where we were at that she was from England. And she'd been in the United States for like 10 or 15 years. And we were driving around, and she would forget. And she would drive on the left-hand side of the road sometimes. Kind of a dangerous thing, acting outside of that normative behavior. Non-normative behavior may or may not have a sinful component to it. Okay? There are things that are just non-normative that are just fine. They're just different. There are things that are sin also. The hog's head on the table, there's no sin involved in that. It's just a completely different estimation of what to expect, and part of growing up, I guess. The children running around this thing, if it had been the same sort of thing and they were doing it, intending it to be worshipped toward the head of this hog, then there would be a sin component involved. Okay, same behavior in a sense, different purpose. Purpose matters. And so we see some of those things. We cannot gauge whether something is right or wrong based on whether it's normative behavior, though. Okay? When the National Socialists took over Germany prior to World War II and eventually started putting people into prison camps, okay, and the guards there marched them off to the gas chambers, the guards were exhibiting normative behavior. It was what was expected of them. They were marching those people to their deaths for no reason, for no good reason. Okay, so when they liberated these camps, General Eisenhower ordered the townspeople to be forced to come into those death camps and see what had gone on. Okay, so that it could not be denied. Now it is, denied to this day. But it was, in a sense, it was forcing the locals to understand what kind of behavior can be forced on somebody else, and the idea where it's a normative sort of thing, and really done in their names in many cases. So that points out that normative behavior can change in a society over time. Okay, when the biggest examples that I can think of in my lifetime, the general societal attitude toward divorce, okay, and abortion and sodomy, those attitudes have completely flipped from when I was growing up. Okay, the sinfulness of that behavior is the same as it ever was in the eyes of God. Okay? Nothing about God's attitude toward that has changed. It's just society has changed. And in this case, changed for the worse. And we have to be careful in the church, in the congregation, that we don't let societal norms become the church's norms. Okay, instead, the church's norms need to really influence us, and hopefully us in turn influence the society, so that societal norms really come back into they become congruent with God's norms. Okay, I think I've said that right. So the secret there, and it's not a very well kept secret, is it's always been that way. Okay, there's nothing new here under the sun. It has always been that way. Karen Murphy was here a couple of years ago, whenever it was, the church versus culture. And he said the church has always been a counter-cultural institution, okay, fighting against sinful norms of society, of the world. So and so it's a fight we have to fight. Our Christian brethren from 100 years ago fought the same general fight with different specifics maybe, but they fought the same fight. And in Revelation 2, and most of you already know where I'm going with this, initially anyway, in Revelation chapter 2, verses 10, when Jesus is speaking to the church in Smyrna, he says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Okay, that was the message to the church in Smyrna. If you read the letters to the other 6 churches, he says the same thing with different words in every one of the cases. You know, basically, be faithful unto death. Persevere. Keep fighting that fight. So the idea of perseverance in the face of what societal norms may become is the message really of all of the letters there. It's the core message, I think, that people need to persevere. That fight the good fight, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. So no matter what time or age Christians live in, okay, there's a normative behavior from God's point of view, and that's the normative behavior that we need to be informed about, and that we always need to be working upon. And you know, when somebody asks you a question of, you know, what does blah blah, what does the Bible teach or the church teach or anything else, or what do you think about this particular thing? If it's a thing on which God has spoken, if it's an issue of morality that God has spoken on, you don't get an opinion. Okay? We don't get an opinion. And we don't have to defend our opinion or defend what the Bible says about something, because God said it. And that pretty much puts an end to the discussion. They may need to be informed about what that is, and that's often the case because people don't have a clue as to what the Bible says or how what the normative behaviors that are expected of a Christian really are, or that God expects of anybody. Okay? We're all going to be held to the same standard. I mean, to the extent we failed it, because, you know, to the extent that we failed to hold to that standard and are Christians, we still can be covered. Our sin is covered by what Jesus did for us, so long as we, you know, repent and continue to strive to follow what God says. So the question is, from God's point of view, what are those norms? What are the norms of Christian behavior that are expected of us? And the best place to probably turn for that is over in Galatians 5. Here, and there's a number of places to go, but here is one that I think you'll immediately recognize, that Paul calls these norms of behavior the fruits of the Spirit. Okay? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. These are things that transcend societies. In every society that you go to, there is no law against patience. There is no law against love. Why not? Because these are norms of behavior that God expects of everyone. And they will always be good from God's perspective. In James 4, we're warned that friendship with the world is hostility toward God. Okay, you're familiar with that verse. The world behaves according to what? The deeds of the flesh. Okay, and back there in Galatians chapter 5:19, the deeds of the flesh are evident: immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. We've talked about these things before. Okay, there's nothing new here that you haven't heard before. The question is, how are you doing? How is each one of us doing when it comes to those things? We're told to examine ourselves before the Lord's Supper. We need to examine ourselves in the light of these norms of Christian behavior, this fruit of the Spirit, okay, and the deeds of the flesh. And when I say, how are you doing, I don't mean just in general terms. Hey, how are you doing? Oh, you know, I think I'm doing pretty good on those things. And kind of a lackadaisical. No. How are you on love? How are you on patience? How are you on self-control? Okay? How are we on those things? And we should probably be the best judge of ourselves. I mean, on this earth, no one knows us better than we know ourselves. So, how are we doing on those things? How patient am I? How faithful am I? And so that leads me to the old question about if you were accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Okay? Boy, I hope so. But should it just be a hope of mine? Or should the evidence really be out there? And the evidence really needs to be out there. Okay? And I don't mean we go around pointing, hitting people in the sternum or something like that, and being ugly in our presentation of God's love. Okay? But when somebody does something that is clearly wrong, we need to take that person aside and say, hey, do you really think that's the best way to live your life? You're heading down a road there that you shouldn't be heading down. But there's two lists there that give us pretty good things to look at, and we can evaluate ourselves based on them. And I think every one of us, I look at those lists and I know, hey, there's room for improvement still. There's still things I need to do. In Psalm 529, this is a familiar song to everybody. You can look at it in your books. Follow me. There's in the third line, if just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. I love that phrase. It's a very convicting sort of thing, because the author's point, the writer of that song, his point is Jesus will not demand more of you than you can give. Okay? But it also means that he does give you the cup of water for a reason. Okay? And it's not so that we can necessarily spend that on ourselves. Okay? That cup of water is given to us as through us as a gift that we can give to others. And we need to be making sure that we're doing just exactly that sort of thing. And really, I think the point is His Word. Okay? His Word is the thing that needs to flow through us by example, so that we can bring a lost world to Christ. So, okay, thank you.